Growing up, I always believed in the strength of communication and transparency. My parents, though flawed in their own ways, taught me the importance of facing challenges head-on, armed with honesty and resilience. As I moved into adulthood, I carried those lessons into my relationships, striving to create a bond that mirrored their depth of commitment. When I met Rachel, I thought I had found someone who shared those values, a partner to build a life with, rooted in trust and mutual respect. In our early years together, everything seemed aligned. Rachel was ambitious, intelligent, and fiercely independent. We supported each other's dreams, making sacrifices when needed and celebrating every shared victory. Over time, though, I began to notice small cracks, moments where her words didn't quite match her actions, or where decisions were made without my input. But love, as they say, is blind, and I chalked up those instances to the inevitable imperfections of marriage. It wasn't until that fateful Wednesday afternoon that everything began to unravel. On Wednesday afternoon, I was deeply engaged in a work conference call when my phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number from another state, one I didn't recognize. Opting to stay focused on the meeting, I ignored the call. Shortly afterward, the notification sound signaled that a voicemail had been left. With the call still ongoing, I returned to concentrating on the budget spreadsheet I was working on, a task that had to be finished before the day's end. Nearly an hour later, I was reminded of the voicemail when the same unidentified number called again. Still immersed in my work, I dismissed the call once more. Yet again, the voicemail alert chimed. This persistent pattern piqued my curiosity, so I decided to pause my work and check the message. The voicemail was from Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, Massachusetts. The caller informed me that my wife had been admitted to the ICU following a serious car accident. They had found my contact details in their records and left a callback number for further information. Without hesitation, I felt an overwhelming urge to drop everything, call the hospital, and head straight to Springfield. Yet, as I drove, an unsettling thought gnawed at me. Why would my wife be in Springfield? Her workplace was in Hartford, Connecticut, about 30 miles away, and she had no apparent reason to be in that area. It took approximately 40 minutes to reach the hospital, where a volunteer directed me to the ICU waiting room. A nurse briefly updated me, explaining that my wife was undergoing surgery and that it might take hours before the surgeon could provide further information. Their immediate priority was stabilizing her condition. As I tried to process what was happening, a police officer approached and asked for my name. "Are you Antonio Caruso?" he inquired. "Yes," I responded, my pulse quickening. "I'm sorry about your wife," he said gravely. "What happened? Can you tell me what's going on?" I stammered, barely able to contain my growing panic. The officer explained, "What we currently know is that she was leaving the MGM Grand Casino when another vehicle ran through a stop sign and struck her car on the side. It's unclear whether she noticed the oncoming vehicle or assumed it would stop. Witnesses reported that the other car was speeding, and the impact crushed the driver's side of her car, forcing it into a parked vehicle. The airbags failed to deploy, leaving her trapped inside for a significant amount of time. Honestly, it's nothing short of a miracle that she survived the collision." I was stunned, barely able to process what I had just heard. "Thank you, officer," I murmured, still grappling with the information. The officer nodded and continued, "I'll leave you to it for now. If we need anything else, we'll reach out. Don't hesitate to call us if you have any questions." As I was about to call Rachel's family, a staff member from admissions approached me. "Mr. Caruso?" she asked. "Yes," I responded, my anxiety mounting. "Do you have an update on my wife? Can I see her?" "Not yet," she said, her tone calm but firm. "However, I need you to review some information for accuracy if possible." "Of course. What do you need me to do?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. She handed me a document. "This outlines her medical history as we have it in our system. Since all facilities within the New England Medical Group share a centralized database, we have a comprehensive record of any procedures or treatments she's undergone at our in-network locations, no matter the state. Please review this for any errors or omissions, paying special attention to medications, allergies, and past surgeries." Taking the printout, I scanned it carefully. The allergies section seemed accurate. Amoxicillin and penicillin were correctly listed. Next, I reviewed the surgeries, which were organized from the most recent to the oldest. The list included her recent vascular surgery to address vein issues in her right leg, a torn tendon repair in her left ankle, the removal of a cancerous mole from her upper back, a torn MCL repair in her left leg, a tubal ligation, and finally, an pregnancy termination accompanied by a dilation and curettage, D&C. I think there's a mistake here, I said, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. All right, let's take a look and fix it if needed. What's wrong? Something missing? No, I replied, hesitating. It's not that. It says my wife had her tubes tied 7 years ago, and around the same time she had a pregnancy termination. I don't understand. And I'm not even sure what a dilation and curettage is. The staff member turned to her computer and began typing. After a moment, she spoke again. According to the records, this is for Rachel Caruso, residing at 24 Birch Street, Manchester, Connecticut. Her social security number matches, and her spouse is listed as Antonio Caruso of the same address. But this doesn't make sense. Rachel never mentioned having her tubes tied, or an pregnancy termination for that matter. And the D&C. A dilation and curettage, commonly referred to as a D&C, is a gynecological procedure, she explained. In simple terms, it involves dilating the cervix and removing contents from the uterus. It's often done following a miscarriage or, as in this case, a pregnancy termination. This procedure was performed at a clinic in Pelham, New Hampshire. At the time, it wasn't part of our network, but it has since been acquired. So the records were imported into our system. Does it say why the procedure was done or who was with her? There's no note about the reason. There usually wouldn't be. But it does list her sister, Ava Dawson, as the emergency contact. Thank you, I said, my voice faltering. Then I paused. Wait, can you confirm if her tubes were actually tied? This can't be right. Rachel and I have been trying to have children for 10 years. There must be a mistake. The records appear accurate, Mr. Caruso. It's highly unlikely there's an error. Can't you double-check? There must be a way to confirm. She wouldn't do this without telling me. I can bring it to the surgeon's attention, but unless it's medically necessary, I doubt they perform any additional procedures right now. Insurance wouldn't cover it, and the focus is on saving your wife's life. Please, just ask. I need to know. I'll note your request in her file for the attending doctors to review, she said. I sat down, reeling. Rachel and I had always talked about starting a family, and we'd been trying for years. Now I was learning she'd had a pregnancy termination and a tubal ligation, all without my knowledge. Why? Had she been lying about wanting children? My thoughts spiraled as I tried to piece everything together. The date on the form stood out to me. 7 years ago, during our 3rd year of marriage, she had told me her sister Ava was having marital problems and needed her support for a week. At the time, I believed it. Ava and her husband Luke were known to have issues, but now it seemed like they'd used that as a cover for Rachel's pregnancy termination. Why? Was the baby mine? If so, why didn't she tell me? And if it wasn't mine, was that why it was kept secret? And why get her tubes tied? Was it so she could avoid having more children with me or someone else? The questions kept coming, each one more painful than the last. I didn't know how long I'd been lost in thought when a doctor in scrubs approached me. Mr. Caruso? Yes, I answered, looking up. I'm Dr. Patel. Your wife is stable but sedated and on life support. Her injuries are severe. There's damage to her heart and lungs, brain swelling and broken ribs, along with a punctured lung, a shattered jaw and cheekbone, spinal injuries, and a broken collarbone. I'm sorry to tell you that we couldn't save her left leg. Rachel's leg had to be amputated below the knee. The damage was simply too extensive for the surgeons to repair. However, the most significant concerns were the injuries to her brain and spine. A neurologist was being brought in to evaluate her case, but it would take several days to determine whether there was any lasting damage. Rachel's recovery would also require additional surgeries, but for now, her body needed time to stabilize from the immediate trauma. It would be hours before I would be allowed to see her. The doctor suggested I step out of the ICU waiting area to get something to eat or drink, mentioning that the cafeteria had better options than the limited choices in the ICU. They assured me they had my phone number and would contact me if there were any updates on her condition. Before the doctor left, I mentioned an issue I had noticed in Rachel's medical records. It stated that she had undergone a tubal ligation, a procedure to tie her fallopian tubes. This didn't make sense to me, as Rachel and I had been trying to have children for years. I raised the possibility of a mix-up in the records and asked if they could verify whether this procedure had actually been performed. The doctor's reaction was less than sympathetic. He fixed me with a stern look, his tone reflecting both disapproval and irritation. He explained that such a request was highly unusual, especially under the current circumstances, and that running any tests unrelated to her immediate survival wasn't a priority. I struggled to keep my composure. I needed him to understand why this was so important to me. For a decade, Rachel and I had dreamed of starting a family together, only to face disappointment after disappointment. Now I was being told by a hospital clerk that she had undergone a sterilization procedure years ago without my knowledge. The implications were devastating. I told the doctor that in his position, he would surely want answers too. His response was blunt. The timing of my concerns didn't matter. What mattered now was Rachel's recovery, and I could address these issues with her once she was awake and stable. I tried to argue that this was about more than timing. My entire understanding of our marriage and future had been thrown into question, and I wasn't even sure I could trust her answers when she was able to speak. Despite my protests, the doctor refused to authorize any unnecessary tests. Left with no choice, I returned to the waiting area, trying to process everything. I had to inform our families about what had happened, but the weight of these revelations left me feeling paralyzed. My first call was to my father. Rachel's parents had both passed away years earlier. Her father from a massive heart attack and her mother from bosom cancer. My own mother had died only 2 years ago, after a long decline following a stroke. Losing her had been devastating for my father, but his role as the family's anchor had kept him strong. Rachel had 2 siblings, her older brother Victor, whom we called Samuel, and her younger sister Ava. Samuel was single while Ava was married to Luke. Both of them lived in New Hampshire, whereas my father lived nearby in Connecticut. I decided to call him first. When my dad answered, his voice was steady, though his concern was immediate. I told him about Rachel's accident, sparing none of the difficult details. He listened in shock as I explained her injuries, including the loss of her leg and the uncertainty surrounding her brain and spinal damage. True to his character, he offered to come to the hospital right away, even though it was nearly an hour's drive to Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, Massachusetts. After hanging up with my father, I decided to call Ava next, leaving it to her to inform Samuel. My first call went unanswered, so I left a voicemail asking her to call me back as soon as she could. Ava worked as a paralegal in a busy law firm, and I wasn't familiar with her schedule, so I wasn't surprised when she didn't pick up right away. About half an hour later, Ava returned my call. She was clearly shaken, her voice full of worry as she asked for details about what had happened. I explained that Rachel had been in a severe car accident and was in critical condition. Her injuries were extensive, and the doctors were still assessing the full extent of the damage. Ava offered to come to the hospital immediately, but her next question caught me off guard. She asked why Rachel had been taken to a hospital in Springfield. I explained that the accident had occurred near the casino there, which was the closest facility equipped to handle trauma cases. This seemed to surprise Ava even more. She asked whether I had been with Rachel at the time, and I clarified that I wasn't in the car with her. The conversation shifted as Ava pressed for more details, questioning why Rachel had been at the casino and whether she had been there alone. Her curiosity felt pointed, almost accusatory. I admitted that I didn't know. Rachel had told me she was going to work that day, so her presence at the casino was as much a mystery to me as it was to Ava. Ava offered again to pack a bag and come to the hospital, but I stopped her. There were questions I needed answers to first, and I believed she might have them. My insistence seemed to catch her off guard, and she became defensive, asking why I wouldn't want her to be there for her sister. I told her bluntly that I had learned things in the past several hours that didn't add up, and I needed clarity before seeing her in person. Although Ava didn't understand what I was implying, I made it clear that this conversation couldn't wait. Reluctantly, she agreed to answer my questions, though her confusion and hesitation were evident. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ava knew more than she was letting on, and that her answers might only deepen the painful questions I was already struggling to face. I interrupted Ava before she could say more. "The pregnancy termination," I said sharply. "When Rachel stayed with you during some so-called marriage crisis, she was actually with you to get in pregnancy termination, wasn't she?" Ava hesitated before admitting, "I'm sorry we misled you, but she thought it was the right thing at the time. She told me she explained everything to you afterward. Why is this coming up now?" "She never said a word to me," I replied, anger simmering. "I just found out today when the hospital reviewed her medical history." "God, I thought she told you when she got home. She swore to me she was going to tell you." "Well, she didn't. For years we've been trying to have a family. At least I thought we were. Now I find out she had a pregnancy termination 10 years ago and had her tubes tied just weeks later. You knew this and kept it from me. That's why I don't want to see you right now." "Tubes tied?" Ava sounded genuinely shocked. "She never mentioned that to me, Antonio. You have to believe me." "Why should I believe you?" Rachel lied to me for a decade, and by keeping this from me, so did you. Who else knows? Am I the last one to find out? No one else knows, at least as far as I'm aware. Luke doesn't know, and I don't think Samuel does either. Why did she do it, Ava? Was it even my child? I need to know the truth. Ava paused. I don't know, Antonio, she said quietly. What do you mean you don't know? She must have told you something. She didn't know who the father was, Ava admitted reluctantly. My stomach turned. So she wasn't sure if it was mine? Are you telling me there was someone else? Ava nodded. Yes, there was. She didn't want to risk you finding out the truth when the baby was born. There was no way to confirm paternity at that stage, so she decided to terminate the pregnancy. She promised me she would tell you everything. I believed her when she said she did. And you forgave her for this? I asked, incredulous. It was such a delicate subject, I never brought it up again. Honestly, I just thought you had forgiven her and moved on, so I kept quiet. Who was it, Ava? Who was the other man, or were there more? Ava hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Can we talk about this later? Right now, I just want to see my sister. Tell me, Ava, I pressed. Without another word, she ended the call. It was clear she wasn't ready to continue the conversation, her focus shifting to Rachel's condition. Hours later, Ava arrived at the hospital. We exchanged a brief glance but didn't speak. She went straight to the ICU nurses' station where she gathered whatever limited information they could provide about Rachel's condition. Slowly, she made her way to where I was sitting. I broke the silence as she approached. Ava, she lied to me. She had a pregnancy termination, and you kept that from me. Ava sighed heavily. Antonio, she told me she was going to tell you. I didn't see any reason to bring it up if she had already come clean. Who was it, Ava? Who was the other man? She hesitated, then answered, It was Adam Sinclair. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Adam Sinclair was Rachel's high school boyfriend, her first love. He'd lived across the street from her, and they had dated for years. I knew the basics of their history, or at least I thought I did. They had broken up long before she met me, and as far as I knew, it was a typical childhood romance, nothing significant. But clearly, I had underestimated its impact. Ava continued, her voice heavy with regret. Adam is fair-skinned, blonde, and has blue eyes, like everyone in his family. Even his cousins are blonde and blue-eyed. Your family and Rachel's both have darker complexions, brown hair and brown eyes. If the baby had been Adam's, there would have been no way to hide it from you. She couldn't risk you finding out that way. 3 years into our marriage, she reconnects with her high school ex and decides to have his child? What the hell, Ava? It wasn't like that, Antonio, Ava said, her tone apologetic. It was worse. And I tried to tell her how wrong she was, but she wouldn't listen. How could it possibly be worse? I asked bitterly. Adam was her first love, Ava began. She gave him everything, including her maid. She thought they were going to get married after high school, raise a family, and grow old together. But at their prom, she caught him having intimacy in his car with one of her friends, Barbie. When she confronted him, he admitted it wasn't the first time, just the first time she'd caught him. She was devastated. She slapped him, walked away, and never saw him again for years. Rachel moved on. She went to UNH, graduated, met you, and got married. Everything seemed perfect. But then, on one of her trips to visit me, during one of her monthly visits, she ran into Adam at the market. She was gone longer than usual, and when she came back, she was glowing, like she was on cloud 9. When I asked, she told me she had bumped into Adam, and they had caught up over coffee. I reminded her of how he had betrayed her and told her it was inappropriate to reconnect with him now that she was married. She brushed me off, insisting it was innocent. I thought that was the end of it. But later, I found out they had exchanged numbers and stayed in touch. The next time she visited me, she had already made plans to meet him and asked me to cover for her. If you called, I was supposed to say she had stepped out and forgotten her phone. This went on for years. She didn't always wait for her monthly visits. She found ways to sneak away and see him whenever she could. Ava stopped talking, her words hanging in the air like a weight I couldn't escape. When I confronted Ava about what I had learned, she admitted Rachel had told her she wouldn't stop seeing Adam. Rachel claimed she loved both of us, Adam and me, and dismissed her actions as just a fling, promising she would end it. She rationalized that since I didn't know, it wouldn't hurt me. Ava confessed how much it devastated her to hear that. She told Rachel she couldn't continue covering for her, that while Rachel might feel no guilt, she did. Ava described feeling ashamed and embarrassed by her own silence over the years. So Rachel cheated on me for at least the first 3 years of our marriage? I asked, the words cutting through my disbelief. Yes, Ava admitted. After the pregnancy termination, I thought she had stopped seeing him, especially during her visits here. When she was with me, I never saw or heard anything about her meeting Adam again. Thanks for being honest now, Ava. I believe you. But I can't help wondering, was she meeting Adam at the casino? I can't think of any other reason she'd be there instead of at work. Ava's voice broke with regret. Antonio, I'm so sorry. I know you must hate me for keeping this from you. But Rachel is my sister. I understand if you don't want me to stay at your house. I'll get a hotel room instead. I needed answers. One more thing. Why did she have her tubes tied? Ava sounded genuinely puzzled. I told you, I didn't know about that. My best guess is she didn't want to go through another pregnancy termination. That's not an easy decision for anyone. It's something you carry for the rest of your life. Even though Rachel cheated, she was still raised as a devout Catholic and went to church every Sunday. She once told me she couldn't imagine life without either of you. She loved you both. But Adam had some kind of hold on her and she couldn't let him go. I think she tied her tubes to avoid the risk of another pregnancy with him. It's the only explanation I can come up with. I shook my head, struggling to process her words. Why not just use protection? She could have had safe closeness with Adam and still had children with me. I don't know. Maybe she did use protection and still got pregnant, or maybe she couldn't trust herself to be careful every time. Maybe it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. Honestly, I don't have an answer for you, Antonio. I wish I did. Silence hung between us. My thoughts spiraled. I'd never felt so lost, so utterly untethered. The woman I loved, the woman I'd built my life around, was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. And yet, everything I thought I knew about her and our marriage was unraveling. I felt numb, as if every emotion had been stripped away. No love, no anger, no pain, just emptiness. In the space of a few hours, my entire world had collapsed. I had to leave the waiting area. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't sit there any longer. The only thing I could think to do was go to the hospital cafe for a coffee. Alcohol seemed tempting, but I knew it wasn't the answer. I sat at a table with my coffee when my phone buzzed. It was my dad. I told him where I was, and he arrived a few minutes later. As soon as he saw me, he pulled me into a hug. I filled him in on everything I had learned. My God, son, he said, his face etched with disbelief. Have you seen Rachel yet? No, and I'm not sure I want to. He nodded, understanding my hesitation. Take your time. You've been hit with a lot all at once. I need answers, Dad. I need to know why she did this. Ava gave me a lot of details, almost too many, but they don't feel like explanations. They're more like a timeline of events. I can see what happened, but I still don't understand why. Why reconnect with Adam after all those years? Why wasn't our life together enough for her? How could she justify loving two men at the same time? And why didn't she just tell me the truth? My dad sighed, his voice heavy with wisdom and empathy. Son, I don't think Rachel or anyone else can ever fully explain why she did what she did. Sometimes people convince themselves they can have it all without consequences. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make it right. But somehow, in her mind, she rationalized it. She thought she could keep her marriage and Adam without losing either. It's foolish, but that's the reality you're facing. So what now? She's been lying to me for at least 13 years, maybe longer if you count when we were dating and engaged. What do I do? What do you want to do? My dad asked gently. I don't know. Right now I'm not thinking straight. I feel completely numb. In a few days I'll probably be furious, and after that I'll fall into a pit of self-pity. I don't know. You've been through a lot in a very short time. No one would blame you for needing time to figure this out, he said. My phone rang again. It was the ICU nurse. They informed me that Rachel was now in room ICU 223 and that I could see her, though only for a few minutes. I ended the call and turned to my dad. They said I can see her now. I'll go with you, he offered. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm not ready. I understand, he replied softly. I need to go home. Follow me there. Okay, son, he said, his voice filled with quiet support. We left the hospital together, the weight of the day pressing down on me like an anchor. On the drive home, my phone rang 4 times. 3 of the calls were from the hospital and 1 was from Ava. I ignored them all. Pulling into the driveway, I saw my dad's car following close behind. Neither of us said a word as we stepped into the house, and I flipped on the lights. Everything felt surreal. My eyes didn't seek out the familiar, a photo of Rachel and me on the mantel, her favorite throw blanket on the couch, or even the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Nothing stood out. I wasn't looking for anything, yet I saw everything and nothing at once. The only thing that grabbed my focus was the liquor cabinet. My feet carried me straight to the tequila without hesitation. As I poured 2 glasses, I heard the microwave humming. My dad was rummaging in the fridge. He pulled out a lasagna Rachel had made, heated it up, and joked about her skills as a cook. He wasn't wrong. She was a damn good cook. But I couldn't muster the energy to care. We sat at the table together. He ate heartily, cleaning his plate, while I just moved the food around on mine. My appetite was gone. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had learned, everything I thought I knew that was now unraveling. I asked him what I should do. He admitted he didn't have an easy answer, which didn't exactly comfort me. Fathers are supposed to have wisdom, right? They're supposed to guide you when you're drowning. But he said this was different. He told me the decision was ultimately mine, but promised to help me figure it out. He pushed me to think about my life before today, how things were before I learned the truth. And honestly, things had been great. Work was going well. I was making good money, managing a solid workload, and building a comfortable life. We had a beautiful home, a reliable car, and strong investments. Our marriage, as far as I knew, was happy. My intimacy life with Rachel had been amazing. I believed I had a wife who loved me deeply. But then my dad said something that struck a nerve. He reminded me that Rachel did love me, even though she also loved someone else. That truth cut deep. Still, he encouraged me to separate what I'd learned today from what my life had been. Until now, the lack of children hadn't been a glaring issue for me. I had assumed we were just facing a struggle with fertility, a challenge we'd eventually overcome. I had no idea Rachel had made the decision for us years ago when she tied her tubes. I thought back to the early years of our marriage. We'd both been tested, and the results showed no issues. A few years later, we were tested again. But this time, we went separately because of scheduling conflicts. Now I realize that wasn't true. Rachel had used that as a way to hide the truth. We never exchanged detailed results, just reassured each other that everything was fine. My dad asked if, without the lies about Adam and the tubal ligation, I would still have considered my life with Rachel great. And the answer was yes. Even if we had discovered that we couldn't conceive, I wouldn't have seen that as a reason to end our marriage. We would have found another way. Adoption, maybe. What mattered was that we were together. But this wasn't that simple. Rachel's lies weren't just about children. They were about Adam, her pregnancy termination, and everything she hid from me. My dad forced me to confront the real questions. Could I knowingly share my wife with another man? Could I forgive her for deceiving me, not just about her affair, but about something as deeply personal as the family we dreamed of building? Could I ever trust her again? The answer came easily. No, I couldn't share her, and I couldn't live with the lies. My dad nodded as if he expected that answer. But then he threw me another curveball. Divorce wasn't an easy option. He laid out the reality. Rachel was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. If I filed for divorce now, before she even woke up, I'd look heartless. It wouldn't matter what she had done, her affair, her lies, or the secrets she kept. No one would care about my side of the story. To everyone else, I'd just be the husband who abandoned his critically injured wife. He was right, of course, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Divorce wasn't off the table, but it couldn't happen yet. Then came the hardest question of all. What were the odds of her surviving? I didn't have an answer. The doctors didn't have an answer, and I was left drowning in uncertainty, unsure of how to move forward. Based on the circumstances, it was clear things were far from good. There was little to do but wait. The accident, not being Rachel's fault, meant the insurance and any eventual settlement would cover the medical expenses. If she survived with significant brain damage, she would likely end up in long-term care. In that scenario, she would effectively be out of my life, and Adam wouldn't be in the picture. It would resemble a divorce, except I'd retain the house and my finances. At that moment, the thought of remarrying was far from my mind, so losing the option wasn't a concern. If she didn't make it, and the thought wasn't entirely unwelcome, I would still keep everything: the house, my assets, the life insurance payout, and any settlement money. In that case, she would be permanently out of my life. But the worst-case scenario was a full recovery, with no brain trauma and only the adjustment of living with a prosthetic leg. If that happened, the situation would be more complicated. Once the immediate crisis faded and emotions cooled, I could pursue a divorce. That would mean splitting everything 50-50. But it was an unavoidable reality. Holding on to a loveless marriage just for financial reasons wasn't something I could live with. Then there was Adam. If Rachel recovered, the question of him lingered. Would he even want her in that condition? It was impossible to know. Maybe Adam had a wife and family, and Rachel was just a hidden chapter in his life. Perhaps a divorce would expose him and unravel his life as well. If he was single, there was always the chance he'd disappear when faced with the reality of Rachel's circumstances. Ava wasn't off the hook either. I needed to talk to her husband, Luke. He deserved to know how Ava had been covering for Rachel all these years. Perhaps I'd plant subtle doubts about Ava's own behavior. Not outright lies, but enough to make Luke reconsider her character. Let him draw his own conclusions. As for Adam, it was time to let go of my anger. He hadn't ruined my marriage, Rachel had. Adam had been in the right place at the right time, seizing the opportunity she gave him. Rachel had been the one to betray me, to break our vows. Dwelling on Adam was pointless, and sharing the details of the affair with anyone outside our small circle would only complicate matters. The hospital knew only what the records stated. Rachel had a pregnancy termination. As far as anyone else was concerned, it was a decision she made in the context of our marriage, and there was no need to involve Adam in that narrative. After my dad finished his drink, he gave me a hug and left. I went upstairs to the bedroom Rachel and I had shared for so many years. Looking at the bed, I couldn't stand the idea of her scent lingering on the sheets. I stripped them off and lay on the bare mattress. My phone buzzed constantly on the nightstand, but I ignored it. Whether it was the ICU or Ava, I wasn't ready to talk to either. Eventually, I turned the phone off and let the silence envelop me. That night, sleep was elusive. I woke around 4 a.m., partly because I'd gone to bed so early and partly because of the nightmares. My mind conjured cruel, vivid images of Rachel with Adam. I imagined her crying out in pleasure, sounds I'd never heard from her before, sounds I believed I could never produce. The thought wasn't based on anything real. I'd never seen them together, but my imagination ran wild, feeding my insecurities. As I lay there, I noticed the room's perfection, a reflection of Rachel's tastes and preferences. Every piece of furniture, every knick-knack, every photo, all of it had been her choice. The realization hit me hard. Nothing in the house felt like it belonged to me. I had let her design everything, and I had simply existed within her vision. It was as if I had no claim to the space we shared. Later that day, I forced myself to go to the hospital. I told myself I needed to appear as the caring husband, even if I didn't feel like one. I brought a book, not because I planned to read it, but because holding it felt like a way to mask my unease. As I walked down the ICU corridor, I imagined the nurses judging me. I could almost feel their icy stares, labeling me as the cold-hearted husband who hadn't answered their calls or stayed to be with his wife. When I entered Rachel's room, I saw Ava sitting by her bedside. Rachel was barely recognizable, hooked up to countless machines emitting a chorus of beeps and buzzes. She looked fragile, her body battered and bruised, her face swollen and obscured by tubes and wires. Looking at her, I felt nothing. The woman lying in that bed was a stranger to me, reduced to a shell of the person I thought I knew. I realized with a jolt that I felt more sorrow for animals I saw lying lifeless on the side of the road than I did for Rachel in that moment. Each day for the next week, I followed the same routine. I'd sit in the hospital room, open a book to a random page, and never read a single word. The chair felt like an extension of me, a fixed point in an otherwise chaotic world, but my thoughts were too loud to focus on anything else. Midweek, Samuel finally arrived. He had been out of the country for work when Ava contacted him, and this was the earliest he could make the trip to Springfield. I updated him on Rachel's condition, explaining the limited progress and the upcoming surgeries she would need. But there was a deeper, more painful truth I hadn't yet shared, one I dreaded revealing. When I told Samuel about Rachel's affair, the pregnancy termination, and her lies about wanting children, his face shifted through a spectrum of emotions: shock, sadness, confusion, and then anger. He struggled to process it, unable to reconcile the sister he knew with the actions I described. At first, he refused to believe it, but I reminded him that Ava had corroborated the story and the hospital's records confirmed it. Reluctantly, he accepted the facts, though his disbelief lingered. Samuel asked what I intended to do, but I had no concrete answers. Rachel was unconscious and in no state to continue lying or sneaking around. Until she woke up, if she woke up, I had no choice but to wait. Samuel offered his support, insisting he would have intervened had he known. He expressed his willingness to help in any way, whether it was taking care of my home or covering for me at work. But there was only one thing I needed from him: to tell Luke. Ava's loyalty to Rachel had been toxic, enabling her lies and deceit. Luke deserved to know what his wife had done. how she had supported Rachel's betrayal and concealed it for years. Samuel hesitated, worried about Luke's temper and the potential consequences. He knew how dangerous Luke could be, especially when alcohol was involved. I left the decision to him, but made it clear that the truth would come out one way or another. If Samuel didn't tell him, I would, though I suggested Ava might be safer if she wasn't home when Luke found out. Samuel seemed to understand, and the conversation ended there. The following week, as I sat in the same chair with the same unread book, Ava entered the room. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen, and she limped as she approached. Without warning, she raised her hand to strike me, screaming insults through her tears. I caught her arm before she could hit me, standing as if to defend myself, but I stopped short. She broke down sobbing, her words tumbling out in anguish. Luke had accused her of being unfaithful. He didn't have proof, but argued that if she could lie so easily for Rachel, she was capable of lying to him too. He called her names, hit her, and threw her out of the house. She demanded to know why I had told him, why I couldn't let it go. I reminded her that the truth had been inevitable. Rachel and Ava had created this mess, and now they had to face the fallout. Ava was horrified that Samuel had been the one to tell Luke. Her panic grew as she realized the full extent of the damage, worried that the entire family would now know. She seemed overwhelmed by the prospect of the truth spreading, but I had no sympathy. If Ava hadn't enabled Rachel's actions, none of us would be in this position. As our confrontation cooled, a nurse informed us there was another visitor. Hospital rules limited the number of people allowed in the room, so Ava stepped out. My brother Mark entered the room. Though not biologically related, he was the son of my father's best friend and had always been like a sibling to me. Mark embraced me, his presence a quiet comfort, and handed me a folded newspaper before leaving without a word. When Ava returned, she looked at me with curiosity. I mentioned Mark's brief visit and his gesture of bringing the newspaper. She seemed puzzled by its significance until I opened it to the page Mark had pointed out. It was the Lowell Sun, a regional paper covering towns in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Ava recognized it immediately, and I prepared to show her something I knew would capture her attention. I slid my chair closer to Rachel's bedside, more for the effect than anything else, and unfolded the newspaper I'd been handed earlier. The article described a gruesome discovery. A mutilated body had been pulled from the Merrimack River the night before. The details were horrifying: severe trauma to the face, limbs removed, and other unmentionable mutilations. Initially, identification had been impossible due to the extent of the damage, but DNA testing later confirmed the victim's identity. The deceased was Adam Sinclair, a 34-year-old father of two from Pelham, New Hampshire, who had been reported missing 3 days earlier. There was no known motive, and the police hadn't provided further information. I couldn't help but wonder why his DNA was already on file. It seemed Adam's clean-cut image might not have been entirely truthful. As I thought about the implications, I mused silently about the coincidence of his name and Rachel's past. Ava's reaction was immediate and visceral. She looked pale, visibly shaken, and accused me outright. Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and anger as she tried to pin the responsibility for Adam's death on me. I reminded her that I had been at the hospital nearly every day, with witnesses to corroborate my whereabouts. I had no motive to act on anything, and the logistics alone made her accusation absurd. Her frustration boiled over as she tried to make sense of it. She pointed to the affair, claiming jealousy might have driven me, but I countered that the supposed affair wasn't public knowledge, and there was no connection between me and Adam that anyone could trace. I even suggested, with a sharp edge to my tone, that perhaps she or Samuel had acted in a misguided attempt to defend Rachel's honor. Her indignation only deepened. She accused me of being cold and unfeeling. I didn't deny it. The weight of everything I had discovered, the betrayal, the lies, the sham of our marriage, had left me numb. I had loved Rachel deeply, but that love had been replaced with a void, as sudden and complete as the collapse of everything I had believed in. The anger, grief, and disillusionment had hardened into something unrecognizable. Ava stormed out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I opened the book in my lap to a random page, but as always, the words didn't register. The days turned into weeks, marked by a repetitive cycle of surgeries and visits to the hospital. Rachel remained unresponsive, her condition unchanged. Eventually, she was transferred to a rehabilitation center. With my vacation time and family medical leave exhausted, I had no choice but to return to work. Though I managed to keep up appearances, my focus had wavered and my performance had suffered slightly. Meanwhile, the news about Adam Sinclair faded away, leaving no further developments or connections to me. At the rehab center, I was asked to review Rachel's medical records again and to complete additional forms, including a Do Not Resuscitate DNR directive. The forms required me to decide on specific actions, whether to allow CPR, electric shocks, or artificial breathing should her heart stop. Another section asked about feeding tubes, whether to continue providing nutrition if she remained unable to eat independently. The questions overwhelmed me. Rachel was already reliant on a ventilator and feeding tube, and the staff explained that these decisions would determine how long those measures were continued. Her heart was beating on its own, albeit weakly, so immediate intervention wasn't required, but the responsibility weighed heavily. This was the moment my father had alluded to, the point at which I could decide to pull the plug. But despite my anger and the pain Rachel had caused me, I wasn't ready to let go. I needed to hear from her. She hadn't denied or admitted anything. I craved the confrontation, the chance to hear her explanations and justifications. I wanted closure, answers to the questions that haunted me. Unable to make a decision, I folded the forms and tucked them into my book, leaving the choice unresolved. 2 weeks later, during a routine visit to the rehab center, I was surprised to find Dr. Patel by Rachel's bedside. He explained that while Rachel was now under the care of the center's medical staff, he felt compelled to check in. Unfortunately, there was no improvement in her condition. The damage to her brainstem remained severe, affecting her ability to breathe and regulate her heart rate. Her prognosis was grim. The likelihood of her regaining independence, let alone consciousness, was almost non-existent. I asked if there was any possibility she might wake up, even if just to talk. Dr. Patel was doubtful, reiterating the severity of her injuries. Then, seemingly unprompted, he brought up the conversation we'd had weeks earlier about her tubal ligation. He confessed that my words had stayed with him, especially as a father of 5. The thought of losing the chance to have children, the way that choice had been taken from me, was something he admitted would devastate him as well. As he left, his words lingered. Rachel's silence, her absence despite her physical presence, felt more suffocating than ever. The doctor surveyed the room with a subtle, almost calculated expression before explaining the additional tests he had performed. He stated that in order to thoroughly evaluate Rachel's condition, he had conducted exploratory procedures to rule out any overlooked internal injuries. Among these was a hysterosalpingogram, a test involving the injection of dye into the uterus to observe whether it flows through the fallopian tubes, if they are intact. The results confirmed what the medical records indicated. Rachel had indeed undergone a tubal ligation. His words carried an air of regret as he apologized, offering a sympathetic nod before leaving. Left alone, I sat in silence, unable to track the passage of time. Minutes, maybe hours, slipped by as I processed this final confirmation. Eventually, I knew what I had to do. I reached into the bedside drawer, retrieved the pen left by the admissions clerk, and unfolded the DNR forms from my book. Slowly, I checked the boxes, deciding to let nature run its course. But I wasn't ready to stop there. Closure demanded more than a signature. It demanded answers. For years, I had trusted Rachel implicitly, never questioning her or invading what I considered her personal space. But now, trust seemed laughable. I resolved to search for the truth she had hidden from me. When I returned home, I went directly to the office and took her laptop. It wasn't password protected, though her accounts, Facebook, email, and Twitter, were. Rachel had never been tech-savvy and always struggled with passwords, often resorting to writing them down. I searched the desk drawers but found nothing. Moving to her purses, bags, and nightstand, I came up empty-handed again. Finally, back at the computer, I noticed the Notes app on her Mac's dock. Clicking it, I found a list of accounts and passwords. Using the information, I logged into her Facebook account on the first try. Among hundreds of contacts was Adam Sinclair. Their interactions, however, seemed innocuous. Messages exchanged over the past few months contained nothing but mundane chatter. Adam mentioned his wife Sheila and their 2 children, John and Kayla. There were no red flags, no trace of an affair in these messages. Next, I accessed her primary email account. Once again, there was nothing incriminating. Just spam, work emails, exchanges with friends, and my own messages to her. Frustrated but persistent, I returned to the Notes app and found a combination of her name and numbers. It looked like another email login. Knowing Rachel's tendency to use anniversaries or birthdays for passwords, I guessed her typical combination and opened Gmail. This time I hit the jackpot. The inbox revealed years of correspondence with Adam. Their emails chronicled the affair from its beginning to its recent state. Their messages described where and when they met, their excitement over stolen moments, and graphic details of their physical encounters. Adam often compared Rachel to his wife, complaining about Sheila's lack of enthusiasm in bed and praising Rachel for fulfilling him in ways his wife never could. The messages detailed the affair's origin, an accidental meeting that rekindled their connection. While their first weekend together didn't involve love, Rachel described a passionate makeout session and a promise to see each other again. Over time, Rachel became deeply emotionally invested, repeatedly urging Adam to leave Sheila and marry her. She even expressed willingness to raise his children, claiming they would be enough to complete her life. Adam, however, refused to leave Sheila. He didn't want to risk losing access to his children. Instead, he convinced Rachel to settle for their monthly trysts. Despite his refusal to commit fully, Rachel's love for Adam clearly outweighed her loyalty to me. Reading the emails, I also discovered Adam's insistence on unprotected closeness, claiming protection caused him discomfort. Rachel, foolishly compliant, agreed. It was evident that her pregnancy had been a result of this recklessness, and the tubal ligation was her solution to prevent future complications while continuing the affair. The final blow came with Rachel's repeated attempts to convince Adam to divorce Sheila. Her declarations of love for him, coupled with her promises to be a better wife and mother, shattered whatever remnants of affection I still held for her. I now had no reservations about signing the DNR forms. 6 months after the accident, Rachel's heart gave out. At her funeral, I played the role of a grieving husband, accepting condolences with a solemn face. She was cremated and buried beside her father in a modest cemetery near the church her parents had attended. Family and friends praised the gesture, noting how much she had adored her father and how he had always called her his favorite. What no one knew was that Rachel's burial was far from what she had wanted. She had made her wishes clear years ago, asking for a bronze casket with engraved flowers, her favorite items placed inside, and a burial at a hilltop cemetery near the New Hampshire seacoast, a place we both loved, where we had met and where I had proposed. We had even purchased a family plot there, but I refused to honor her wishes. There was no way I would be buried next to her, not after what she had done. Rachel had written her own ending, and I made sure it was on my terms. The life insurance policy was going to come in handy, especially since I was planning to move to New Hampshire myself. Samuel and I still got along great, and the idea of buying a house there, with room for a boat, felt like a promise of good times ahead. Fishing, relaxing, enjoying the water, it all sounded perfect. Meanwhile, the settlement from Rachel's accident was still under review, but it looked like it could turn into a windfall. The guy who hit her had been drunk, way over the legal limit, at a company event, driving a company car with a suspended license. It was a mess, and my lawyers were going to have a field day with it. Ava and Luke's divorce wasn't a shock. Him hitting her was the breaking point, but it wasn't the only reason. He refused to admit he had a drinking problem or deal with his anger issues. Ava was furious at Samuel and me for telling Luke what we knew, but I don't regret it. We did the right thing. It freed her from someone who didn't deserve her, and if that wasn't worth the fallout, I don't know what was. When I shared my findings about Rachel with Samuel and Ava, I knew it would hurt them, but I needed to get it off my chest. Rachel had been a victim, yes, but so was I. I wanted vindication, something to set the record straight. Samuel was devastated, disgusted by what I told him. Ava, though, was different. She was angry and upset, but she hugged me through her tears, apologizing for everything. I could see how deeply she felt it. As for me, I've always wanted children, but I'm not in a rush to remarry. I figure it'll happen when it's supposed to. Or maybe I'll end up with someone who already has kids. There are a lot of single moms out there, after all. One thing I do know, it won't be the widow Sinclair. That thought drifted away as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at my phone. The world outside felt oddly frozen, like everything had stopped just long enough for me to breathe. The chaos of the last few months had finally settled, leaving me in this strange, still moment. I thought back to the call that had come out of nowhere. The question I'd been asked still felt surreal in its simplicity. "Do you like soup?" At the time, it had caught me off guard. Without thinking, I'd answered, surprising myself. I hated it earlier, but now I do. Even now, sitting here alone, I found myself chuckling at the absurdity of it. Soup. What a ridiculous code, but somehow it worked. It was so simple, so unassuming, yet it felt like it meant something deeper. Comfort, maybe, or clarity in the middle of chaos. It was a strange kind of poetry. I thought about everything that had happened. The anger, the heartbreak, the betrayals, For so long, those feelings had weighed me down, but now something else was starting to emerge. Satisfaction. Not joy or triumph, but a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. The buzz of my phone pulled me back to the moment. Another unknown number flashed on the screen, but this time, I didn't answer. I placed the phone on the table, leaned back in my chair, and let myself linger in the silence. The question still echoed in my head, along with my answer. I like soup now. And maybe, just maybe, I'll like whatever comes next.